This was the first, but certainly not the last, dialogue between the institutional investors and asset owners that form the growing association of asset owners and the companies that they privately own or partially own. And it was a very interesting conversation. My takeaway is first that there is an extraordinary willingness to have that conversation, because there is a fundamental understanding that neither side can actually decarbonize effectively at the speed and scale that we need, and that it actually has to be the result of a good understanding between both sides. The other takeaway that I took is that there were very impressive calls for more rigor, for more sectoral coordination, so that not every company has to invent the cold water again.
It was a very optimistic session. I'm the CEO of PensionDanmark, one of the founding pension funds in the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. Half a year ago we were only 6 pension funds. Now we are more than 12, and more are in, let's say, in the pipeline. So from total assets at approximately $2,000 billion US, we now have passed 4,000, and by the end of this year, we probably will have pension funds with more than $10,000 billion US in the alliance. This means that in the coming years, you will really see the asset owner industry move on the climate agenda and engage with the companies where we are shareholders in order to help them define their business models in a more climate friendly way.
We've got 3 key takeaways from today's session at Davos on the UN Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. And those 3 takeaways are around the key role that asset owners have got to play in this transition, encouraging portfolio companies and their asset managers to transition to net zero by 2050. The second key takeaway is around timing, and speed is very much of the essence. This is not just about 2050, but also about the short term. And the third key takeaway is around the sector transitions that are needed. This means the hard to abate sectors like aviation and cement, but it means all sectors working together with asset owners.
There are 3 takeaways that I have from the Asset Owner Alliance meeting here today. Firstly, the asset owners need to behave as such. We need to own the assets that we have in our portfolios and make sure that the people who we elect to represent our interests, the chief execs, the chairman, that they know exactly what it is that we're demanding of them from a climate change perspective. We also need to make sure as asset owners that our asset managers are behaving as we would like to see them do. So that was 1. 2, we also need to help the companies do scenario plans that make sure their business follows the Paris Agreement. And the third opportunity that we have coming out of this meeting was to create at COP26 an intergovernmental panel on climate finance, something that enables the negotiators to understand what's happening in the markets and informs the negotiators about how money is flowing and whether it's aligned with Paris or not. There's a little clause in the Paris Agreement called Article 2(1)(c), and that clause says that all of the governments have already signed up to making finance flows consistent with Article 2(1)(a), which is all about 1.5 to 2 degrees. So it's already there in the Paris Agreement.
A very important meeting. This is the first time that this group of very significant investors, both insurance companies and pension funds, have gotten together with the other 2 key stakeholders, one being the corporates that they own, that they need to influence in terms of making the transitions towards net zero. And also interesting in the room are some from the governmental side, a lot of messages around the relationship between capital flows, the roles of investors and policymakers.
So this was a very important meeting we just had of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. It's early days yet, but they're really taking leadership role in helping to push the financial sector forward towards the kinds of changes that are required if we're to have a global transition of the economy and society to address the climate crisis. I think coming out of the meeting, the key takeaways for me were the need for greater attention to just what does it mean to be net zero, and I know that they sort of are stretching, not really knowing what that meant, but the emphasis now has to be on defining that and coming up with appropriate metrics. Also not waiting for this 2050 target, but really putting a heavy pressure for early action.
I believe what was really very, very welcome by all those people talking here was indeed that corporates are really looking forward for long-term investors to join them on their long-term development. But also from policymaker side, clearly there was, I would say, almost respect that now asset owners come forward and align their overall objectives with what governments already have pledged. And in terms of the targets, people also welcomed a lot that it is not only something like net zero in 2050, but they understood and discussed with us, it's clear that there will be targets, intermediate targets like 2025, and already very, very clear how we are going to move towards this net zero in this stepwise approach. So it's a very concrete initiative that we have here with now an ever-growing network amongst asset owners and corporates and policymakers.
It was a very promising session, I have to say. It's very clear that we need long-term investor like Allianz, Swiss Re, and hopefully many others which will join to finance the big transition to a more sustainable but also to a lower carbon world. And knowing that this is a very expensive transition, you need funds like long-term investor money which ultimately manage over 80 trillion, and only through that bridge I think we can make it viable. But it's also a great opportunity. I think it's very important that we not only talk amongst us asset owner but also with the company which actually needs to make the decision. And even more important is that we also need to have the public sector involved, because through discussion, through cooperation, which is urgently needed, we will agree on standards. And standard means we need to know what reporting looks like, but also we need to know how we want to measure success. And that's why the Asset Owner Alliance is very promising, because it's very tangible. That's why a very credible goal, which is net zero by 2050.